So thank you so much for having me here today. Some of you may recall that I met a little bit over a year ago with the FEI group and shared a little bit about emotional intelligence, and it was a great conversation, and so I'm very appreciative that you've asked me to come back this year. So as Kathy was sharing, today we're going to discuss some ways to build influence through productive communication. And that's a huge topic. I'll be quite honest. I feel like we're just going to be really just touching the tip of the iceberg here, but I hope you'll be able to walk away with some nuggets of information and ideas that you can use, whether you are currently in a role as a consultant or whether you are in the process of looking for a new job and giving some thoughts to what might be ways to make yourself more viable in your interviews. So as consultants, we need to quickly relate to clients, or as when you're interviewing, you need to quickly relate to whoever you're recruiting with in order to build their respect and create influential change or influential impact. So today, what we're going to do is look at some of those tools to help you be influential. But before we dive in, I just would like you to maybe list on the chat room, what are some of your definitions of influence, and specifically influence as you are working with clients or, in the work world. So I'm going to let Kathy kind of capture some of those and maybe shout those back to us.
So just go ahead and type in a word or two in the chat section. What comes to mind? Cooperation. I know it's early, folks. We're all just rolling out of bed and getting started here.
Okay, maybe another question too that might be one to ask is, what do you find is your greatest challenge building influence when you have conversations?
Here's some other ideas that came in, Marilyn. Conveying ideas for achieving results, respect. Oftentimes it's easier almost to think of a person you admire or see somebody in that, in a role, and what characteristics do they embody for you? Resonating, connecting with people.
Okay, these are great. So hopefully our conversation today will touch on some of those words and give you some ideas about how you do have the ability to create impact, results, connect, all of those different kinds of traits that you already define.
Another good one that came in, Marilyn, is influence without authority as a consultant.
Oh, I love that one. So we're definitely going to be talking about that quite a bit today. So great.
Okay.
So let's delve in a little bit into what I call, sadly, the one-on-one of, or like class book, textbook 101 about influential communication. And this is just a good refresher before we go into really the nuts and bolts of what we're going to do today. So the reason I put this up here is I think this is probably fairly evident to anybody who's on the call right now. They've probably seen these 5 C's that are used for influential communication. Like I said, a lot of textbooks, a lot of books have been written about this. But it kind of helps build onto what we're going to talk about in a few moments. So the 5 concepts are clarity, which is around creating understanding, creating decisions and action and consensus, and creating a sense of what are the benefits of the actions that are taken. Concise is the second one, and that just deals with being prepared, resonating with impact, only using words that speak of value. Confidence is just being comfortable in your own skin when you communicate with people. Making people feel comfortable, people feel like they can be open with you. Credible is all about trust. Having conversations that are trusting, factual, not filled with passive words, communications that avoid hiccups. And when I say that, doing what I just did, saying it's that those times when you speak and you sound hesitant or you use those filler words, so it kind of breaks apart whether you sound credible or not. And then the last one is compelling. And that is around sincere, honest, believable, and being able to truly reflect your own passion and commitment to whatever it is that you may be communicating about. So this is all great. And I always start with this, but like I said, I feel like this is textbook 101. So much is written about these 5 concepts, but nobody, or I shouldn't say rarely do people, really go into how do you make this happen? What are the tools that you are going to be able to use so that you can come across clear, concise, confident, credible, and compelling? So we're going to do a little bit of that today. I'm going to talk about 3 different concepts. The first one is about understanding your own communication and workplace behavior, and more importantly, understanding other people's communication and workplace behaviors. The second thing we're going to talk about is flexibility and adapting to situations. How do you personally adapt your style so that you can most impact other people? And the last thing we're going to talk about, again, another very large topic, and we're only going to be able to touch a little bit on this, is some tips about managing difficult conversations. So let's move into the first one, which is the understanding of communication and workplace behaviors. Why do we do this? When you best understand yourself, you're able to, have insights to help you adapt how you prepare for discussions with other people. You're able to have a better questioning strategy, and you're better able to not only manage your workplace behaviors, but help guide other people's workplace behaviors. You're better able to understand the primary needs and wants, probably is appropriate to add here too, of others and your own. And as always is important, it improves your working relationships. So I'm going to do a simple interactive exercise to help you get into the idea around workplace behaviors and how to have a greater impact. So I need you to grab a piece of paper. You just need a little scrap piece of paper, nothing particularly large. If you have an 8.5 and 11 in front of you, that's fine. If you just have a little small piece of paper, go ahead and use that. And what I'd like you to do is I would like you to create this type of graphic on your piece of paper. And you don't have to necessarily write out all of the words on the top and the bottom, but basically the 2 arrows going from 0 to 10. And if you have the room and you want to put 1 through 10 on there as opposed to just going from 0 to 10, feel free to do so. I just didn't do that for the sake of making the graphic a little less busy. So I'm just going to pause for a moment and let you kind of create that graphic.
Good questions.
Okay. So I have a question for you here, and that is, has anybody done a DISC analysis or a DISC assessment? So Kathy, if you can kind of let me know if there are a number
if you want to
of
just put a Y, if you've done the DISC, just put Y in the chat, and we'll get a handle on, what percent on the phone have done DISC. Well, less than half the group, Marilyn, have done it.
Okay. It's not uncommon.
Many have said it's long ago as well.
Yes. DISC is probably one of the most common assessments done for people to understand their own work style. And it's highly effective. And we're going to talk a little bit about yourself, but like I said, I think a big value with DISC is understanding other people. So if you have done it, this may be a little bit of a refresher, but I do ask that you kind of go through the exercise, because we do find that this is a great tool for conversation as you think about your own style and how do you communicate with other people. So what I'd like you to do is on the vertical line, I'd like you to give some thought to, are you more of a fast-paced, assertive, outspoken person, or would you say that you're more a thoughtful, cautious, and methodical person? And what I need you to do is I need you to say, using the example that I'm fast-paced, where do I stand on that from a range of 0 to 10? Am I highly fast-paced? Maybe I'm a 8, 9, 10, or am I sort of mediocre? So whatever you are, you know, whether it's fast-paced or thoughtful, 0 to 10, just make a little mark on that line about where you stand. So again, maybe you're moderately fast-paced, so you give yourself a 7. And then what I'd like you to do is to count to 10 the opposite direction. So if you gave yourself a 7 as fast-paced, count down to 3 on thoughtful and cautious and methodical and make a line there. Or just a little small line across the axis. Make sense? Any questions? Hopefully I'm giving pretty
Let me see
straightforward.
if there's a question. No question specific to that.
Okay, great. So then looking at the horizontal line, a very similar approach. Are you more of a questioning, logical, focused, skeptical person, or are you more accepting, people-focused, and warm? And similarly, depending on if you see yourself highly moderate or on one of those, make a mark, the one that you lean closest towards. And again, after you've done that, count 10, either to the right or the left, depending on where you put your mark, where you have the most space, and mark that. Okay, so once you've done that, you will connect those 4 lines, and you should end up with a box that looks something like this. Obviously, they will not all be in this quadrant, but you should have some kind of square that you're able to create. And ideally, you should have 1 to 2 boxes that are larger than the others. Now, what we just did was a very simple DISC analysis or DISC assessment. And we'll go a little bit deeper into what this all means on the next slide. What I always like to share here, though, is that this is not the full DISC assessment. This did not just keep you away from doing the very impactful DISC, because the very impactful one, the formal one, actually goes into many, many different scenarios. So it'll ask you, are you fast-paced in this type of situation, or are you thoughtful in another types of situation? And it brings it all together and gives you a much more realistic picture of what your work style. But I have found that about 80% to 90% of the time, people know themselves well enough that they figure out kind of what box they are, sort of what I would call is their dominant box. And again, we'll go into details here in the next slide. So any questions before we go on? Because I'm kind of going through a little bit of an exercise without...
You know, there's a question that I think I'm going to hold it to the end, Marilyn. It's more a general question around consulting.
Okay.
So I'm go ahead, continue.
Okay, great. All right, so thank you for going through this exercise. Like I said, it's kind of a fun little way to, if nothing else, get you kind of up and going early in the morning. So what we just did, like I said, is a very simple DISC assessment. And depending on what quadrant was your dominant quadrant, the largest one, you generally fall into one of these 4 categories. So, and I will tell you, chances are, having been a finance person, I am guessing, and you guys can maybe respond if this is true or not in the chat, most of you fell into conscientious or dominant. That's very common for people in the finance world to be kind of where they resonate. So there is not a square or a circle here, or a quadrant that's right or wrong. You shouldn't feel like, oh, I came through steady. That's not a good thing. Everybody's strengths are different, and there is not one that you have to look at and say, yep, that's a better one than others. Interestingly enough, too, when you actually do the full disc, you generally fall into 2 quadrants. So, for example, I'm dominant conscientious. I grew up in the finance world. So again, I think that's not particularly surprising. I'm very analytical. I like people to be, when they come and meet with me, I like them to have a pretty good and strong plan about what it is we're going to talk about. I like to make sure that I'm a little risk averse. I like stability. So I tend to fall into that conscientious with a little bit of dominant in there. So I'm curious, anybody have any insights or any thoughts about where they fell and some of the definitions of what their quadrant identifies? I'm just going to ask if there's anything in the chat room about that.
No, but you can, folks, you can put it in the chat, or if those of you that have taken DISC know your style, and usually you look at the top 2, you'll recall the letter. You might be a DC or a DI. If you recall that and want to type that in the chat, that's fine. Okay, Marilyn, you can, let's wait, something came in. How much has the DISC assessment evolved over time? Is this now more focused on emotional intelligence, maybe?
Great question. I think that has factored in, and actually it's a great segue into what we're going to talk about next. The assessment itself has improved, I believe, over the last 20 to 30 years since the first time I had one, in that it originally started out being about you, who you are, what's your traits, how do you fit in, and in the last 10 years at least, it's moved more towards understanding not only yourself, but understanding others, and how do you work together as a team. So that's actually the part that we're going to focus on next, and I think it's where the real strength in DISC is now. I happen to believe that most people have a pretty good sense of who they are. And so when the slide that the exercise we just did and the slide we're looking at, I would doubt there's any surprises to people about what they see. But the challenge is, and this is where the whole idea of influence comes in, is, so I know this about myself, but how does this impact my communication and my relationship to others? So let's look at the next slide. And I will tell you right now, because there's a lot of information on it, I'm going to be sharing these slides. So don't feel like you have to memorize everything on this page, for sure. But this is where I think the part about work style and really comes into play as it relates to influence. If you can truly understand yourself, and if you can fairly quickly assess the person you're working with, you can figure out ways to communicate with them, reduce their frustration, reduce your frustration, and have a much stronger relationship. And we all know relationship is where influence comes into play. So an example that I always like to use is I have done quite a bit of DISC around the sales teams. So salespeople typically fall into that influential style. They They're out there working with their, I mean, and I bet this scenario is going to resonate with many of you. They're out there working with the client. They want to have discount pricing, and they come back to the finance group and they say, best customer ever. We really have to do something for them. I don't want to lose them. And they think that they can just throw that on the finance team, because I've had this happen to me. And you guys are all going to sit there and say, you know what? We understand. Best customer ever. I don't want to lose them. But that's not the reality of how the relationships often go. The finance people are going to say, well, that's great, but I need you to give me some quantitative information about this relationship. Why is this the best customer ever? Can you give me some guidelines about what maybe the thresholds they can handle and pricing will be? And you're going to want some information that you can take back and do some research, and that has some logic to it and has some financial results to it. So I would always spend a lot of time with these salespeople saying, if you want to work with, have a strong relationship with them, and again, because I was in banking, it often was with the treasury management people, if they were lending people, you have to be able to put together a pretty decent plan about why this is a value to the client and to the bank, and has a relevant impact. And maybe even talking about capacity filling. Could be a lot of different things. So that was a lot of training I would do with the salespeople. Conversely, as a finance person who wants a lot of details, you're going to find that the salespeople don't want to give it to you. So when you're having conversations with them, maybe you have to be willing to do a little more brainstorming, and let's do some what ifs, and give them the opportunity to think through what the ramifications are of what they're asking, because they're not going to necessarily try to do a very narrow, detailed plan. So that's why I love this page in particular, because it gets you to start thinking about not only myself, but who am I relating to? Who is it that I need to influence? Who do I need to work with? And how can I make an impact on their ability to make good decisions? Any questions about this before we move forward?
No.
Okay.
You still can type them in, folks.
Do you find this a good page? I particularly love this page. I hope this is something that you look at and go, oh, this is very helpful.
Marilynn, I agree. I think, there's a lot of content on the page. So in the Zoom environment, I like it because it's easy to see. But, it's helpful for all of us as leaders, because I love the gets frustrated by. So because these are cues for you to recognize in other people, and that's how you know how to flex your style then.
And I think this is really useful. If I recall correctly, Kathy has shared with me that a number of you are out there looking for contract work, or maybe even interviewing for a full-time position. And this is very useful in the interviewing process as well, because again, you have to quickly assess the person that you are working with during the interviewing process. And you may be trying to figure out, well, are they a dominant personality, influential personality, conscientious personality? And so one of the things that I find often useful is just to ask a question like, when you are in a decision-making or strategy planning session, how do you like to put together the plan? And that can give you some cues, and I'm just using that one as an example, but that can give you some cues. Maybe the person says, oh, I love having the group get together and brainstorm, that we sort of have, the whiteboard and we just fill it up. Or you have the person who says, no, I really like to sort of direct the plan and have other people kind of give me the supporting information around it. Well, just getting those two answers tells you the first person is probably a little bit more towards that influential style. So then the rest of your interview, you have a little bit more of a sense of how maybe they like to behave. The second person is probably leaning towards dominant, They want to feel like they're the ones in control and other people are feeding them information. And that can impact greatly how the rest of your interview goes. So this is a useful tool, not only when you're working with teams, but trying to size up the person that you're interviewing with and the dynamics of how that particular organization, or at least that person in his immediate or her immediate group, works.
Marilyn, a couple questions have come in. So one is there a generational difference in this, or do you evolve over time during your career?
Great question. I do think that there is a generational difference going back to the part that we talked about at the very beginning around confidence and credibility. When you're new in your career, and you're trying to establish yourself as credible, and you're trying to build your own confidence in who you are, you probably don't always demonstrate outwardly some of your workplace characteristics. So you may be a highly dominant person, but in the organization, you learn to be a bit subjective, subservient, I guess would be the word, because you're not quite at that position where maybe showing your dominance is particularly effective for your long-term career. So I think as you move up and you become a little bit grounded in your job, either through becoming more experienced with age and experience and maturity, or whether it's just that you've been in a job for maybe a year versus just a couple of months, your traits come out a little bit stronger. You adjust a little bit your style because you're still figuring out what you can and can't get away with. And that sounds terrible saying it that way, but there's some reality to that.
Okay, and then another question that came in said that the chart is very helpful, and the question is, how do lawyers usually fit into this, and in what profile?
I will tell you, I have seen them all over the place. It really depends. There are people that have to take a very strong leadership role, and so you'd think that maybe they should be dominant because of that, but they're actually very much the steady person. They're really about people and relationships and being methodical. So it really varies. Every person's a little bit different.
Okay, and then to the steadiness, so another comment came in. I would have thought the examples would be more indicative of steadiness and conscientiousness style, respectively.
The examples, I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I'm following that question.
Yeah, I think it's a comment. Jerry, if you want to elaborate on that, I'll come back to that. So go ahead, Marilyn, why don't you continue and we'll come back.
Okay. All right, so we're gonna pivot a little bit. So like I said, this page is a great communication planning tool. Works very well with one-on-one discussions. But the reality is sometimes you have to think about things from the perspective of reading the environment quickly and creating immediate results. So we're gonna switch gears a little bit and talk about a second tool. So the DISC assessment is a great tool for influence. Now, the second one is around situational leadership and adapting to situations. So again, I'm going to ask the question, has anybody ever done the situation leadership classrooms or programs?
I would say probably that situational leadership, that dates back probably to at least 15, could be 20 years, time flies, but we have one yes, mostly no's.
Okay, so it is a little bit, it was very popular about 10 to 15 years ago, but I'll tell you, it's a little book. It's not even a half an inch, and it's a book that I have used over and over again. It's one of those kind of classic, timeless types of ways of thinking about things. Some books have been written since. They're basically the same thing, and they just call it their own name. But what this is around is that the key to this is you as the leader, the consultant in engagements, is the one who has to change their style. And that doesn't mean not be true to who you are, but you have to have that ability to be flexible and adaptive so that you read the environment and you read what are the needs of the people that you are engaging with. And again, even when we talk about interviewing, you're able to read a little bit about what are the expectations that the recruiter may have of who you're going to be once you get into a new role. So the couple of key things that kind of are good to think about here is the leader, the consultant, is the one responsible for reading and understanding the environment. They're the ones who are responsible for role modeling the behaviors that they want to see out of the people in the group. And they are the ones who need to build the tools to influence change and behaviors. So that's why the leader adjusts and not expect the others to adjust towards their traits and behaviors. And this is just another little bit of a recap. A little bit harder when you're a consultant, but recognizing past behaviors is one of the reasons that it is good for you to be the one who is willing to make the adjustments. Definitely as a consultant, you're trying to redirect future behaviors and you're trying to change and control the behaviors of the team. So this is a very, again, kind of detailed page, but it's a good page to have because it helps you give some thought a little bit to what it is that you're trying to do through situational leadership. So the two lines that you see that says directive behavior and supportive behavior, that's the consultants or the leader's role or their behaviors that are being demonstrated. So for example, if you're put into a situation where you're coming in and you're being asked to totally reinvent the procedures and the processes in an organization, and you have a fairly, I call, basic, steady group of people that are making the change, you probably have to start adjusting your behaviors to be a little bit more directive. Defining plans, creating goals, watching timelines, overseeing the actions that are taking place, and having a certain amount of control. The flip side of it is if you're being asked to come in and do a consulting engagement, and it's all about maybe helping the team be better at what they've done before, maybe adjusting the procedures a little bit, doing some tweaks, just kind of getting them a little bit more into the right direction, but they sort of have some good basics, and and the team is very adaptable. You're probably going to be more into a supporting role. So this is just a nice graphic to have out there to give some thought to. Well, what is the right behavior I need to demonstrate in order to make the changes and influence the results of the people that I am working with when I'm in an engagement. Now, another way I think this is also very useful is when you're interviewing. This is a situation where if you are having a conversation with the recruiter or the manager that you might be working for, you can start asking them a little bit about what is it that they have as expectations of your management style or your leadership style with the team. So it gives you a flavor to find out, again, are they looking for somebody who is very directive? They want somebody, especially, maybe it's the closing the books, every month, or then everything's reconciled, very, very tactical things. Or are they looking for people who are going to be leaders supporting the actions of others as opposed to necessarily having a direct impact on them? And this is always a really good tool too. If you're moving from like a very definitive role, maybe working within a line of business to close the books and such again, to more of a leadership role where you have oversight of those people that are going to be in the directing roles. So thinking about when you do your questioning and or sharing your examples of your experiences, you can think about, well, if I'm moving into a higher level leadership role, I want to share some examples about being a supporter or a coach and less about being a director or a delegator. So this,
Marilynn, just a comment or a potential question too. I mean, when folks are interviewing, and most of the type of roles they're interviewing for are going to be these directive roles, right? These CFO or high-level leadership roles. So what's the best way for them to interview and showcase their directive style, especially in a Zoom interview environment?
oh, great question. So I go with the approach of using something that's called STAR interviewing, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's where you are, and this is something you can plan well in advance. You can have these written down. STAR stands for being able to share with people a situation, what were the tasks that needed to be accomplished in that situation, and then you very much then focus on what are the actions you took and what were the results. So that's where the STAR comes from: situation, task, action, and results. So if you have 2 or 3 of those lined up, where you can say, I had this very specific problem or scenario that I had to deal with on a regular basis. These were the things that had to happen on a regular basis. These are the actions I took. These are the results. And definitely when you have results, if you can quantify the results, do that as much as possible so that people can see that the results had a definite bottom line impact.
Great advice. And I think, everybody on the call obviously has the resumes together. So what Marilynn's talking about, your STAR statements, or sometimes we call them SARs, are your accomplishment statements on your resume. To reinforce those accomplishments, use the same action verbs in your conversations when you're talking about your accomplishments that you have indicated in writing, and do clarify with the numbers when you can.
And I would actually say that no matter what you're interviewing for, you can use that STAR approach. Even if you're doing something where you're moving into leadership and you want to talk about the fact that you coached people, that you developed a team, that you moved them into being in the position where they could have the results and the bottom line impact. You were critical in getting that team to that point. So if you're in a position, if you're moving from directing up to a more leadership role, that STAR impact, how you develop the team, is just as effective as it is when you're talking about some very specific things that you might be talking about under the directing quadrant. Okay, so the last part about the situation leadership, because I want to make sure we're giving ourselves good timing here, is the other piece of it is understanding the readiness of the client. And this is just a nice page to have. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's really important that you understand the readiness. And the readiness, the thing I always like to leave here is don't assume it's a lack of ambition. Oftentimes readiness is just people don't have the right skills, experience, and knowledge. And that's where the coaching comes in. You're teaching people to learn those new skills. Some of it is that they don't have the confidence. Nobody's actually spent the time with them and helped them feel kind of committed and motivated to what they're doing. So this is always a good piece to have when you're thinking about what role do I have in influencing results and understanding and reading the environment. I guess the message here is, can I change the environment by developing the people? And as we all know, whenever you develop people and you make them feel successful, you've built a strong relationship and you've created influence. So bringing it together, that what do I need to do? How do I need to fit into the situation? And how do I better prepare the people that are in the situation is where the influence really comes to play. Okay, So we're going to move into the last one. But before I do, I'll just pause to see if there's any other questions that came in.
No, I think we're good.
Okay. All right. So now we move into the really fun one. And like I said, this one is huge. And we could talk forever about challenging or difficult conversations, whichever term you want to use. But I just kind of want to leave with two ideas here. The first and foremost is influential people do not avoid difficult conversations. That's probably the most critical thing. They don't postpone. They're not passive about it. I won't necessarily say they embrace them, but they effectively deal with them. And there's two critical things that influential people do when they have difficult or challenging conversations. One is they recognize and they create the opportunity for the free flow of information. They get all the relevant information. They encourage people to be open and honest. They listen to ideas and opinions, and they help people have the ability to articulate those ideas and opinions. And what I mean by that is once people start sharing things with them, they're willing to drill down with asking questions to really get to the point. And the second part of it is they find a way to create as much as possible outcomes that feel collective, are collective hopefully, and create some form of buy-in by the two parties that are involved in the conversation. Now it's good to remember that not all outcomes are going to be accepted by everybody, but if people at least feel like they had their say in the matter, they were able to share their opinions, they know how the outcome came about, it's a lot easier for them to accept something that may not be ideally what they wanted. So again, this is all around don't stay away from the conversation, keep it open, and make sure that the outcomes are as acceptable as possible for all parties involved. So that's really easy to say. So I'm going to give you a couple of tips that might help on making that happen. And like I said, this is something we could be talking about for hours. So just, I realize we're kind of brushing this quickly. To me, the most important thing to do is to focus on your controllable, which is your frame of mind. And when I do executive coaching, this is probably something I talk about the most, is you can't always control what's happening with the other person, but you can control yourself. And the reality is, when the whole topic of difficult conversations is much easier to share in a one-on-one with people because you can use very specific scenarios, as opposed to we're kind of doing this broad brush right now. But I would say probably 99.9% of the time, I start with, let's talk about you and how are you reacting to the conversation, or how you're reacting to the challenge presented to you. And there's a few things I like to highlight here. One is, because some of these I think are obvious. One is the moving forward. Don't get caught up necessarily in the present or the past, but find the way to make sure that whatever is happening is about moving forward, making improvement, being positive, but that forward direction is critical. Another piece that I think is know when you need to pause. And sometimes we get into difficult conversations and we think the best thing to do is to solve the problem right now. It doesn't always work that way. And I think everybody knows this. Sometimes you need to be able to say, I need to walk away from this. We're going to end the conversation for now, and allow maybe emotions to calm down a little bit. And we'll pick this up in an hour, tomorrow, a week, depending on, the scenario. Again, it's kind of depends on the situation. But don't be afraid to pause. And even if that pause is just for 30 seconds while you're thinking about something. And then the last thing is to let it go, but remember it for future reference. And what I mean by this is not to hold a grudge, which may be what that implies, but rather remember how that person reacted or responded. What were their hot points? So you're better prepared and you know what may occur in future conversations or future situations. So the letting it go is, okay, today is today, this is what happened, but but know that there are certain things, again, going back to DISC, that cause frustration for somebody because their style is different than the style that you may have, or that if you're mediating a situation somebody else had. So I always think that's probably one of the wisest things, is to manage yourself. The second thing is, and this is a little bit utopian, I admit, is if you have the opportunity, prepare for difficult conversations. One of the things I have personally learned is that I'm going to go to, I'm thinking about when I've had to do individual development plans for somebody who's going on, because they're in the position where they're probably going to lose their job. And so I have to sit down and really put together that really tough discussion. I always, as much as possible, tried to practice and anticipate their reactions, their questions, and their comments. I practiced my coming across as objective as I possibly could. And I really gave some thought to questions that they may have and questions that I may have about the situation. And I found that I actually always over prepared. The conversation was never as bad as I anticipated it would be. And that helped a lot. Personally, I think it helped me personally, because it's like, okay, I did better than I thought it went. I think it helped me realize that maybe I showed the right type of approach for the person. But that preparing can be hugely beneficial when you have the opportunity. And then the last piece I always like to talk about is make sure you end with an action plan. And that action plan in any conversation can even be as simple as, let's continue this discussion again in a couple of weeks. Let's come back and talk about what's happened. Have things improved and such? It does not have to be a definite action plan, but ending any difficult conversation with, we're going to do something, gives people a sense that they were heard and that they were acknowledged in terms of whatever their issue may be. So some of the action plan ideas that might be useful include the following. Have a stop, start, continue type of discussion, and I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with this, but it is usually about behaviors on both parties that they're going to stop doing, they're going to start doing, or they're going to continue. And this is done a lot when you do mediation type of difficult conversations, and you're sitting there trying to help out two different people who are just not getting along with each other. But you have them both, not you, but they both have to come up with actions that are going to stop, start, and continue. Just like with teenagers, because I always remember having this conversation with my teenage daughter, we did not focus on the person, we focused on the behaviors. And I always laugh about the comment about, I love you very much, but I really don't like how you're behaving right now. And so, you may not quite say it that way in a professional environment, but that idea of having the conversation about, I have concerns about this action I saw, as opposed to, I don't like the way you did such and such. Switches from behavior, focuses on the behavior and not on the person. And that's a little bit under, you'll see the thing where I said, use I. When you can, if you can use I as opposed to you, it always helps with the conversation because it takes defensiveness away from the other person. And a couple of other things, framing, that's you have to be a little careful about this, but that's when you try to you don't make the person either an angel or a devil. You kind of bring in both elements of good with both in the conversation. I really like when you do X, Y, or Z. I struggle a little bit when you do something else. And that's a little bit of what framing is about. The thing that you have to be very careful about with framing is that you don't hide the issue in the framing. You have to be still direct and kind of straightforward about what the issue is. But again, don't make the person feel like it's you're all bad or you're all good. You have to let them see that you see both traits in them. And the last thing I always end with is, no matter what the difficult conversation is, thank people for their time and for their sharing of the ideas. I just think that is, if you end a really challenging conversation with thank you, it just helps so much with the sharing the respect and acknowledging that you respect the person, even if you don't agree with what the conversation may have been. So these things, I put this in here with influential conversation because, like I said, I feel it's really important for people to realize to be influential, you have to openly accept the fact that you need to have difficult conversations, and that if you create action plans, if you focus on yourself versus the other person's issues, you generally can come across as very influential and impactful in the way you handle the conversation. So that's
Marilynn, a question came up. Doesn't the word "but" invalidate what was said previously?
yeah, that's probably true. I probably could have said it differently. Sometimes it's just statement. Don't put the "but" in between. I like how you do X, Y, and Z. I would like to see you do whatever a little bit differently. Don't put the "but" in there. Because you're right. I used to always joke about, or however is another one that you want to avoid. But the overarching thing is maybe not so much how you frame the question, but making sure that you don't put people in the position where they feel like you're telling them they're all bad or you're telling them they're all good, and you're not kind of doing some kind of blend.
Good advice. I think, the other thing, when you know you're going to go into one of these crucial or difficult conversations, taking the time to think through it and probably script it out and plan your conversation. That'll avoid those kinds of words popping up that when you're in the moment, it's hard to think through, right?
Exactly, and that's why I love when you can.
Yeah.
I love when you can to prepare, because you will over prepare. And you're right. When I do that, I have written out the pluses and the minuses, or type of thing, or the good things I want to share and the not so great things I want to share, so that I say them, like you said, succinctly and concisely, going back to those 5 C's at the very beginning, not getting myself off on some trend that probably isn't necessary to be bringing up. In fact, may be causing me to say something that just sends somebody off in a different direction that I hadn't even planned. So thank you for reminding me of that. Any other questions? That's pretty much what I wanted to share, and I think we're getting close to the top of the hour.
We're getting close to the top of the hour. I think that's, there was, let me see.
Oh, I'm going the wrong direction here.
One other question, if I can rephrase it properly, is somebody saying they're in a directive role where they're less hands-on and charged with leading change versus the day-to-day managing it. What would be some best ways to handle that?
Oh, leading change versus managing change. That's a whole topic that, as Kathy and I know, we talk about in our mentorings program, because there's a big difference between the two. And managing change is leading change is much more about influencing. I think the number one thing there is around communicating the why of the change as opposed to the how to make the change. And what are the benefits that are going to come out of it? What are the ways that this is going to impact both their work, the organization's work? And I always like, when you're in a position of having to lead change, find some early adapters. If that's an opportunity that you can have, where maybe you do spend a little bit of time managing the change with those 1 or 2 people, but then they become your advocates and help you with creating change.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, Marilynn, and thank you all for your great questions and for dialing in today. We want to wish you a happy 4th of July. Also remind you our next FEI CMG meeting will be on August 6th. So be sure not to miss it. Laurel Bellows, who's an attorney, will be speaking on negotiating your employment contracts and, you know, talking about all things new and related to COVID as well. So thank you all for participating and for your lovely comments throughout the session.